Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking philosopher Peter Boghossian's truly fascinating framework for understanding modern ideologies, and really the deep sociological shifts happening right now in our culture. If you've been looking at the world lately and feeling, well, just a sense of confusion about how certain ideas are suddenly grouped together, this breakdown is going to provide some incredibly helpful context based directly on Boghossian's recent analysis.
So let's dive right into this by asking a fantastic question straight from the source. Why do activists today frequently group completely distinct, completely unrelated global issues together? I mean, you see it all the time in modern advocacy, right? A movement that's dedicated to one very specific global challenge will suddenly release a manifesto or a fiery statement about a completely separate geopolitical conflict. It's a phenomenon that leaves a lot of people scratching their heads.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with bundling unrelated political causes, move into evidence versus ideological coherence, explore the postmodern subjective term, examine the substitution hypothesis, and finally, look at navigating institutional distrust.
Okay, Section 1. Bundling unrelated political causes. The mystery of intersecting activism. Let's start right at the surface layer with this modern trend of tying entirely separate political arguments into a single identity.
Boghossian examines this by looking at prominent figures like Greta Thunberg. He points out that while 97% of scientists agree on the realities of climate change, things get genuinely confusing when climate advocacy is suddenly bundled with commentary on incredibly complex geopolitical conflicts, like the relations between Israel and Palestine. The real question Boghossian is raising here is, why is a completely separate issue presented alongside climate action in the exact same breath, as if the two are somehow intrinsically linked?
And here's the crucial point. We live in a 24-hour news cycle where social media algorithms and the constant hunt for clicks put a ton of pressure on everyone to act like leading experts in, well, absolutely everything. One day it's virology, the next it's international geopolitics. Boghossian suggests that in a culture where people who haven't thought about a region for 2 seconds suddenly act like PhD scholars, just admitting, "I don't know," is actually a surprisingly powerful, honest, and refreshing answer. Honestly, we need to normalize saying thank you when someone admits the limits of their knowledge.
Moving on to Section 2. Evidence versus ideological coherence. The architecture of our beliefs. Let's peel back the next layer and look at the psychological mechanisms behind this. Why exactly do people feel the need to have an opinion on everything?
Boghossian brings up this brilliantly blunt quote from Christopher Hitchens to explain the trap of ideological thinking. Hitchens argued that if he knows 2 of your beliefs and can perfectly predict a third, you're a very boring person. Why? Because it means your beliefs cohere purely because of a rigid ideology. They're neatly bundled together for you. It makes you entirely predictable, and crucially, it means you're divorced from formulating opinions based on actual independent evidence.
This beautifully illustrates Boghossian's ideal framework for how we should think. He suggests our mind should operate a lot like pointillism paintings. In pointillism, individual distinct dots of color are placed independently on a canvas to eventually create a cohesive picture. Our beliefs should be exactly like those dots, formulated independently based on distinct pieces of reason and evidence. The alternative is ideological coherence. That's where people extend their confidence in a belief way beyond what the evidence actually warrants, just to make sure it fits neatly into their pre-packaged worldview.
Which leads us to a critical litmus test for our own thinking. According to Boghossian's framework, you should always be asking yourself and others, what would it take to change your mind? If a piece of evidence could theoretically be presented that would shift your view, well, then you're reasoning based on evidence. But if your answer to this question is absolutely nothing, then your belief is not formed on the basis of evidence at all. It's an ideological fixture.
To show what this looks like in the real world, Boghossian points to Michael Schellenberger's work. He notes that within rigid ideological environmentalism, highly viable, low-carbon energy solutions, like nuclear power, are often taken off the table a priori. They are just dismissed before evidence-based consideration even begins, simply because they don't cohere with the specific aesthetic or narrative of the overarching ideology.
Section 3. The postmodern subjective turn. Moving away from objective truth, we are now peeling back to the philosophical root of this bundling, looking closely at how society actually perceives truth itself. So, to understand this, we need to introduce the concept of postmodernism. Classically, it's defined as an incredulity toward meta-narratives. A meta-narrative is just a grand, overarching explanatory principle. Think evolutionary biology or traditional Christianity. Thinker Helen Pluckrose refers to the modern, hyperactive iteration of this as applied postmodernism. In this worldview, grand, universal explanations are totally rejected. Instead, we are left with highly individual, atomistic views of reality.
Boghossian argues that over the last 30 to 40 years, society has made a dramatic, fundamental philosophical U-turn. We have largely demeaned the concept of objective truth, the idea that we can ascertain universal facts about the world. And in its place, we've elevated subjective, lived experience and alternative ways of knowing. Reality is no longer something we discover together. It's something you just experience personally.
Now look, subjective lived experience absolutely has its place in our personal lives. It is the perfect tool for deciding what kind of food you want to eat, what music resonates with you, or who you choose to love. But Boghossian's framework highlights a really severe limitation. Lived experience completely fails as a tool for discovering objective, scientific, or historical facts about the external world. When we try to use it for that, the systems just break down.
And this subjective turn, it can lead to some incredibly surreal, almost disjointed cultural moments. Boghossian references a comedy sketch by Ryan Long that perfectly captures this. In it, an actor is frantically trying to figure out the right subjective ideological stance to take on global conflicts, just to appease his followers. He looks to institutions for guidance, only to find international bodies like the UN tweeting completely unrelated identity politics slogans during times of literal geopolitical crisis. For Boghossian, this highlights the absolute absurdity of institutions trying to navigate colliding, subjective ideologies instead of just focusing on objective realities.
Section 4. The substitution hypothesis. What replaces religion? If objective truth is fading, what is driving all this new fervor? Let's look at the sociology.
Looking back over the last 30 years, it's wild to see the massive cultural shift in who is actually enforcing morality in society. Boghossian uses author J.K. Rowling as a fascinating cultural barometer here. Decades ago, she was facing fierce backlash and protests from the religious right over themes of witchcraft. But today, the intense protests and moral outrage directed at her come from a completely different faction, what some called the regressive left. The source of the moral policing has flipped entirely.
Borrowing a concept from Game of Thrones, Boghossian introduces the substitution hypothesis. In the show, characters talk about the old gods and the new. Boghossian asks a really profound question. Is superstition and ideological belief simply the default setting for human beings? If so, as traditional religious beliefs like Christianity decline in the West, that void doesn't stay empty for long. New gods, these emerging rigid ideologies, must rise up to fill the vacuum. We haven't become less religious, we've just substituted what we worship.
Cultural thinkers have a lot of different names for this new replacement religion. Wesley Yang calls it the successor ideology. Majid Nawaz terms it regressive leftism. Helen Pluckrose uses applied postmodernism. And colloquially, you'll often hear it called wokeism. Interestingly, Boghossian notes that evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins has expressed deep hope that this substitution hypothesis isn't actually true, because if humans are just hardwired to invent new superstitions when old ones die, well, much of his life's work advocating for pure secular reason would be in vain.
Section 5. Navigating institutional distrust. The consequences of coherence. Finally, let's look at the real-world fallout. What actually happens to a society when this philosophical and cultural shift takes over its major structures?
The analysis brings up this raw, intense quote from writer Florence Reed. It perfectly captures the societal angst and, honestly, the downright terror generated by this era. When subjective lived experience trumps subjective facts and ideologies demand you bundle entirely unrelated causes together, the cultural landscape can feel exactly like what Reed describes, a uniquely confusing and chaotic age to navigate.
So what's the result? Well, it's a fundamental breakdown. The explainer points out that we are seeing highly educated figures like Supreme Court justices struggling to state basic biological definitions out of fear of ideological backlash. Thinker John Reiki notes that even our most advanced technologies, like artificial intelligence, are at risk of being born into idiocy because they're being trained on this skewed, highly subjective cultural data. Ultimately, this leads to a complete breakdown in institutional trust and the demeaning of meritocracy. Ideological compliance suddenly becomes way more valuable than actual competence.
We are going to end this explainer with Boghossian's unresolved cliffhanger. With objective truth fading and institutional trust collapsing, the massive question left for all of us is, how do we restore a culture based on evidence and reality? It's a huge challenge, and it's a question that demands an answer.